shadows stretch long across the hollows, there exists a darkness that modern man has long since forgotten. It is a land defined by blood and soil, where the laws of the city do not reach, and where a man's last name is his destiny. The Hatfields and the McCoys have lived in these mountains for generations, and their hatred for one another has become as much a part of the landscape as the winding rivers and the rocky cliffs. But in the year 2007, this ancient feud took a turn toward the supernatural in a way that would leave the hills forever scarred. It began with a secret that could have saved them both, a forbidden love between Ricky McCoy and Jody Hatfield. They met in the hidden places of the forest, away from the prying eyes of their kin, hoping that their union could finally bridge the gap between their warring families. But the universe of the backwoods is not kind to dreamers, and their hope was shattered in a single night of violence when a group of Hatfield boys fueled by whiskey and misplaced pride struck down Ricky's younger sister in a hit-and-run accident. They didn't stop to help, and they didn't show remorse leaving the young girl to die in the cold mud of the mountain road. When Ricky found her, the grief that washed over him was so cold and so heavy that it squeezed the light right out of his soul. He didn't want justice from a judge, and he didn't want an apology from the sheriff. He wanted a vengeance that would echo through the trees for 1,000 years. Against the advice of the elders and the whispers of the wind, Ricky sought out the one person everyone in the hollow feared to speak of, the old witch Haggis. She lived in a shack that looked like it was being swallowed by the swamp, surrounded by the bones of things that had lost their way. Ricky begged her to call up the demon of vengeance, the one they called Pumpkinhead Haggis, warned him that the price of such a summon was not paid in gold or silver, but in the very essence of his humanity. She told him that once the demon was set loose, it would not stop until the blood of his enemies was spilled, and that he would feel every cut, every break, and every scream as if it were his own. Ricky, blinded by his rage, accepted the pact and watched as the ancient withered creature was pulled from the earth, a towering, spindly nightmare with skin like cured leather and eyes that held the cold fire of the grave. The demon began its hunt, moving through the woods with a terrifying grace that defied its massive size. It didn't just kill the Hatfields, it toyed with them, turning their own fear into a weapon. It snatched them from their porches and pulled them into the darkness of the canopy, leaving only the sound of snapping bone and the smell of wet earth behind. At first, Ricky felt a grim satisfaction as he sensed the terror of his enemies. But soon the weight of the connection began to crush him every time Pumpkinhead struck a Hatfield. Ricky would double over in pain, coughing up blood and feeling the phantom stings of the demon's claws. He realized too late that the monster was not his servant, but a reflection of his own hatred, and that by killing his enemies, he was slowly killing himself. And the woman he loved, Jody Hatfield, found herself caught in the middle of a literal hell, trying to protect her family from a monster they couldn't see, while trying to save the man who had unleashed it. The feud that had started with a stolen pig or a property line decades ago had now become a cosmic tragedy as the demon began to target even those who were innocent of the original crime. The forest became a graveyard of screams as the Hatfields tried to fight back with steel and lead. But you cannot kill a shadow with a bullet, and you cannot outrun a curse that you carry in your own heart. As the sun began to set on the final day of the feud, the two families were forced to stand together in a desperate stand against the creature they had collectively created through their centuries of malice. Ricky and Jody met one last time in the clearing, where their love had first bloomed. But now the air was thick with the copper scent of blood and the heavy breathing of the monster that lurked just beyond the tree line. Ricky looked into the eyes of the demon and saw his own face reflected in its dead stare, and he understood the final lesson of the witch. The only way to kill the demon was to kill the hate that fed it, and that hate was rooted deep in his own chest. In a final act of sacrifice, Ricky turned his back on his vengeance and embraced the destiny he had chosen for himself, hoping that by ending his own life, he could sever the cord that bound Pumpkinhead to this world. The demon vanished back into the shadows of the earth, leaving the survivors to pick through the wreckage of their lives and realize that the blood of a brother and the blood of an enemy are exactly the same color when they are spilled in the mud. The mountains return to their silence, but the wind still whispers the name of the man who traded his soul for a vengeance that cost him everything he ever loved. And the legend of Pumpkinhead remains as a warning to anyone who thinks that the past can be buried with a shovel, or that a feud can ever be won with anything but forgiveness. The survivors of the first night of terror huddled in the shadows of their cabins, clutching their rifles with white-knuckled grips and praying for a dawn that seemed like it would never arrive. The woods had become a living, breathing enemy, and every snap of a dry twig or rustle of a leaf sounded like the heavy footfall of the demon coming to claim another soul. Jody Hatfield sat by the fireplace, watching the embers die out and feeling a coldness in her bones that no flame could touch because she knew that the man she loved had crossed a line that led straight to hell. Ricky McCoy was out there somewhere, bound to the monster by a silver cord of agony, and every time the creature moved through the undergrowth, Ricky felt the scrape of the bark against his own skin, as if he were the one stalking his own kin. The Hatfield patriarch, a man whose heart was as hard as the mountain granite, refused to believe in ghost stories and commanded his sons to go out and hunt whatever animal was killing their people. But you cannot hunt a curse with lead and gunpowder, and the forest swallowed the men one by one, leaving only their discarded lanterns flickering in the mud. Pumpkinhead was not just a killer, it was a psychological tormentor that used the memories of the feud to sharpen its claws. It appeared in the reflections of the creek and in the distorted glass of the windows, showing the Hatfields the faces of the McCoys they had wronged over the last 100 years, forcing them to confront the weight of their own malice before it ended their lives. Ricky collapsed in the dirt near the old witch's shack, his lungs burning as if they were filled with wood smoke, while he felt the demon tearing through a heavy oak door miles away to reach a cousin he had played with as a child. The connection was absolute, and Ricky realized that the vengeance he had prayed for was a mirror that only showed his own destruction. Jody found him there lying in the weeds, and she saw the mark of the demon beginning to etch itself onto his forehead, a jagged scar that looked like the roots of a dead tree. She begged him to tell her how to stop it, but Ricky could only whisper that the monster was hungry for more than just blood. It was hungry for the very idea of the feud, and it wouldn't stop until there wasn't a single person left with either name to carry on the fight. They decided to move toward the old family graveyard, where the first Hatfield and the first McCoy were buried side by side in a rare moment of peace before the war began, hoping that the sacred ground might offer some protection or a clue to breaking the spell. The air in the graveyard was thick with a fog that smelled of ancient dust and forgotten tears. And as they stood among the leaning stones, the demon emerged from the tree line, its silhouette blocking out the moon. It didn't attack immediately, but stood there watching them with a patient curiosity, as if it wanted them to understand that they were the ones who had built its body out of their own bitterness. Jody stepped forward with a kitchen knife, her hands trembling, but her heart steady with a desperate kind of courage, telling the beast that the cycle ended with her. But the demon only let out a sound like grinding stones, a laugh that chilled the air for miles around. Ricky realized that the only way to hurt the monster was to hurt the source of the hate, and he turned the barrel of a fallen rifle toward his own chest, knowing that his life was the battery that kept the nightmare running. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the lovers stood at the center of a storm of their own making, realizing that the shadows of the past are only as long as the people who choose to stand in them, and that the only way to outrun time is to stop the race altogether before everyone is lost to the dark. The ancient stones of the Hatfield and McCoy cemetery seemed to groan under the weight of the supernatural fog as Ricky and Jody stood paralyzed by the sight of the demon looming over the very ground where their ancestors had first drawn their knives against one another. Pumpkinhead didn't just stand there. It began to pace with a predatory elegance circling the iron-wrought fence, as if it were savoring the final moments of a century-long harvest. Ricky could feel the creature's heart beating in synchronization with his own, a heavy, wet thud that vibrated through his ribs, and he realized that the monster was drinking the lingering resentment that still soaked into the very soil of the graveyard. Today, you think that a grudge is just a memory, but in the shadows of the backwoods, a grudge is a living thing that feeds on the blood of the young to stay strong. Jody clutched a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, a McCoy by birth, who had married into the Hatfields during a brief season of peace, and she held it out like a shield, hoping the small token of unity might burn the demon's eyes. But Pumpkinhead only swiped the air with a claw that looked like a curved obsidian blade, shattering a nearby headstone into 1,000 jagged teeth. The witch haggis appeared at the edge of the clearing, her silhouette twisted like the roots of a dead cedar, and she laughed a sound that was more like a rattle of dry bones than a human voice. She told them that the demon was no longer just a servant of Ricky's rage. It had become the physical embodiment of the feud itself, a grand monument of meat and malice that would continue to hunt long after Ricky was gone, unless they found the original source of the hatred. She pointed to a sunken grave in the far corner of the lot, a place where the grass refused to grow and the earth was as black as charred wood. And she told them that beneath that soil lay the remains of the very first betrayal that had sparked the fire. Ricky and Jody began to dig with their bare hands, the cold mud caking under their fingernails and stinging their skin. While the demon drew closer with every inch of dirt they moved, the air grew colder, and the sound of phantom gunfire and shouting voices from decades past began to echo through the trees as if the history of the mountain was being replayed in a frantic loop, just as Ricky's fingers brushed against a heavy iron box buried deep in the earth. The demon lunged its massive jaws opening to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth that had tasted the blood of a dozen Hatfields already. Ricky shoved Jody aside and braced for the impact, feeling the creature's cold skin against his chest. A sensation like being crushed by a falling glacier. But instead of tearing him apart, the monster paused, its head tilting as it sensed the contents of the box. Jody pried the lid open to find not a weapon or a curse, but a simple bundle of letters and a lock of hair, revealing that the original feud had started over a misunderstanding of love and a broken promise rather than a stolen animal or a land dispute. The realization that so much blood had been spilled over a lie sent a shockwave of grief through Ricky that was stronger than his anger, and for a single moment, the connection between him and the monster flickered like a dying candle. Pumpkinhead let out a low, mournful howl that shook the very foundations of the mountain, as if it were grieving for the lives it had been forced to take to sustain a falsehood that had outlived its creators. The witch warned them that the truth was a double-edged sword, and that while it might weaken the demon, it would also make the monster's final moments the most violent of all, as it struggled to justify its own existence. The ground began to tremble, and the trees started to lean inward, as if the forest itself were trying to crush the secret they had uncovered. Jody looked at Ricky and saw that his eyes were turning the same pale, milky color as the demon's, and she knew that the time for words had passed, and the time for a final sacrifice had arrived. Keep your spirit steady and your heart focused on the light, for the shadows of the empire of hate are long, but they are thin when faced with the truth of a human heart. The iron box lay open in the mud, its contents a silent witness to a century of pointless slaughter. And Ricky could feel the demon's grip on his mind beginning to splinter like dry wood in a storm. Pumpkinhead let out a low guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of his bones, as it realized the foundation of its existence was built on a shadow of a lie. Today, we think that the truth sets us free. But in the dark hollows of the mountain, the truth is a heavy stone that can crush the life out of a man who isn't ready to carry it. Jody grabbed the bundle of letters, her fingers trembling as she read the words of a McCoy boy pleading for peace with a Hatfield girl 100 years ago. And she realized that the original sin was not a theft or a murder, but a pride that refused to listen to the heart. The demon lunged forward, its massive claws raking the air and leaving glowing trails of cold blue fire that smelled of ozone and ancient rot. Ricky stood his ground, his eyes now completely white as he channeled the collective grief of every soul that had been lost to the feud, and he felt a strength that didn't come from anger, but from a deep and final exhaustion. The witch haggis watched from the edge of the clearing, her face a mask of twisted amusement as she told them that the only way to banish the beast was to burn the memory of the hate right out of the soil. She handed Jody a small torch made of dried hemlock and sage, and told her that the fire must be fed by the letters and the blood of the last two lovers who still carried the names of the warring clans. Ricky reached out and took Jody's hand, his skin feeling like cold marble, as the demon shrieked a sound that was like 1,000 glass windows shattering at once, because it knew its time was drawing to a close. They laid the letters on the open grave, and Jody struck the flint, sending a shower of sparks onto the tattered paper that had waited a century to be read. As the flames took hold, a thick black smoke began to rise, coiling around the demon's spindly limbs like iron chains, and pulling it toward the open earth. Pumpkinhead fought back with a terrifying ferocity, its tail lashing out and shattering the remaining headstones into dust, while its roar shook the leaves from the trees in a single violent burst. Ricky felt his own heart slowing down, matching the rhythm of the dying monster. And he looked at Jody with a smile that was both a goodbye and a blessing, telling her that the shadows were finally retreating into the past. The demon began to dissolve into a cloud of ash and embers, its terrifying form shrinking until it was nothing more than a pile of charred bones resting on the letters that had summoned it 100 years before. The fog began to lift from the graveyard, revealing a pale gray dawn that looked like the first light the mountain had seen in 1,000 years, and Ricky fell to his knees, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the silver cord that bound him to the nightmare finally snapped. Jody held him in the mud, her tears washing the grime from his face as the silence of the forest returned a deep and holy quiet that signaled the end of the blood feud. At last, keep your eyes on the rising sun and never let the darkness of a grudge blind you to the beauty of a second chance, for the empire of hate has fallen and the ground is ready for a new kind of growth. The dawn that broke over the Appalachian peaks was not like any other. It was a thin, brittle light that seemed to struggle against the weight of the secrets still buried in the mountain soil. Jody sat in the mud of the graveyard holding Ricky's head in her lap as the last of the black smoke from the demon Pumpkinhead drifted away like a bad dream caught in the morning breeze. The monster was gone, its physical form reduced to a pile of charred bone and bitter ash, but the silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like a physical pressure on their chests today. You think that when a war ends, the peace begins immediately. But I tell you that the end of a feud is just the beginning of a different kind of struggle. The struggle to remember how to live without a target for your anger. Ricky opened his eyes and the milky white film was gone, replaced by a clarity that looked like he had seen the very bottom of the universe. And he told Jody that he could still hear the whispering of the ancestors in the trees, but the voices were no longer screaming for blood. They were just tired travelers asking for a place to rest. The witch Haggis stood at the edge of the clearing, her shadow stretching long and jagged across the broken headstones, and she warned them that the earth has a long memory and that the ground they were sitting on would always be a place where the veil between the worlds,